Hi, my name is Wilson Goeda. I'm from South Africa. I'm married with Grace Goeda. She is originally from Namibia. We've been married now for 25 years. We have two beautiful children, Michael Andrew. He was born in Cape Town, but for the last 3.5 years he's in Sydney, Australia with Youth with a Mission. Then we have a beautiful daughter, Arawa. She was born in New Zealand and she's second year in university. And I would love to share with you my story and my journey and testimony. Thank you so much in advance. My mother was 16 years old when she fell pregnant with me. She was still a little daughter, didn't know much about herself, but she met this handsome guy, my father, and one thing led to another. 2 months later, she realized and discovered that she was pregnant. Her father was a lay preacher, and so it was very difficult for my mother to take the news back to him, because she was aware of that the shame will come on the whole household and the whole family, and was very conscious of what people would be thinking. So she decided to go and tell my father that she was pregnant. Upon hearing the story, my father ran away. I grew up and I never had a chance of meeting my father. I have been praying many times to meet him, and I've never had the opportunity, like many children, to have a father and be able to cry on his shoulder. My father simply ran away. My mother was from what we would call colored in South Africa, and my father was part of the tribe of Nelson Mandela, Xhosa man. And so when my mother realized my father had run away, she wanted to commit abortion, I was told. So she decided to jump 3 times from the roof of the house to commit abortion and suicide. And I don't have to tell you today that as I'm sitting here, my life and my story is a miracle because God protected me. After the 3rd jump from the roof, and she was not able to commit abortion and suicide, she decided then to go and tell her father, my grandfather, that she was pregnant. Obviously, they were very disappointed, and she was taken out of school. And when I was born, my mother had to go and work as a domestic worker. But before I start there, doctors will tell you at a certain stage in the womb of this mother, the child can begins to pick up sounds and becomes aware of everything. And the way God has designed family is that unborn child, that the mother and father needs to talk to that child, welcome that child into this world. And so even long before I was born, I was aware of that. This very mother that was supposed to protect me and love me and welcome me wanted to kill me. So the day when I was born, I never wanted to live. I was born with extreme inferiority. I remember when some of the pastors come and visit, do house visitation at our house, I would hide underneath the bed because I was so aware of that they represent my mother and the very people that wanted to kill me. And I remember my mother had to work as a domestic worker for white people in the house. So I hardly grew up with my mother. I grew up with my grandmother and my father, and occasionally every 2nd month I would see her, and then she would come and bring some sweeties, and I have fond memories of my mother. And the first thing that happened was, I remember that the elders of the Dutch Reformed Church came one evening to our house. It was a Wednesday evening. I was about 6 years old, turning 7. And this specific evening, they were talking about how, in the scripture out of Matthew, if your earthly father knows how to do good, how much more your heavenly Father? If you ask for a fish, he will not give you a snake. Now that evening, when they were preaching, I missed my father extremely, and I thought, man, this is an opportunity that I can give my life to Jesus. And so when they made an altar call, that evening, I put up my hand and I said I wanted to accept Jesus. There was nothing major that happened after I prayed the sinner's prayer, except when I went to bed that evening, I had this warm feeling with me. But then 6 months later, my mother died. And I couldn't understand, how can a loving God, how can a God that says He knows everything, that He wants to give the best, take my mother? I remember when I was standing at the grave of my mother, and they lowered the coffin. See, I had nothing to live for, because my only security, which was my mother, was taken away, because my father was never there, so my mother became my security. I remember when they were lowering the coffin into the grave, I wanted to jump into the coffin, not physically but spiritually, because I had nothing to live for. I felt that day I died with my mother. I remember as my family were crying around and we walk away from the grave, it was like my world, just turning 7 as a boy, my world was tearing apart inside. Walk away from the grave, I heard myself saying to God, God, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. I don't want to do anything with you. That's how I walked away from that grave that day. The next 2 years was very difficult, very traumatic 2 years for me. I missed my mother very much. I felt like the way my family treated me was not the same. So here's the first incident that happened with me. I remember we had to go to school, and we had to walk for many, many kilometers, about 12 kilometers every day to school. And I grew up under apartheid, which was the segregation where there was white buses only. And so we had to walk, and I knew that the white bus would pass my school, and we were taught that we need to say to white people, bars. But this specific morning, it was so cold. And I remember I've put my feet in the manure of the cows just to be warm. And right in front of me was the white-only bus, and I saw all these kids the same age as I. They were all getting into the bus with all the beautiful blazers and the shoes and socks and suitcases. I had a little plastic bag with my books in. And I knew I wasn't supposed to get a lift, but that morning was so cold, I stood there, and when all the children said, I looked to the bus driver and I said, Bars. That's how we were taught to call them bars. Can I have a lift? And he looked at me without saying a word. He slammed the door in my face and he drove away. And at this age of, I realized that the root of bitterness has entered into me. I remember I walked to school that morning, and I was thinking, why didn't he give me a lift? Was it because I was black? And all of a sudden, the root of bitterness began to take place in my life. I remember when I came back from school that afternoon, I went and sat in the back of our house, and I began to miss intensely my father. And I remember I began to blame him for not being there for me. Begin to blame him for being poor. Begin to blame him for not being there to protect me. And that was the first incident that shaped my life, where I became aware of the bitterness towards different people, and especially white people. The second incident that has shaped my life, I remember after 2 years, I worked through the death of my mother, and I began to be very excited, and I began to find my joy in my books. I did very well in school, and I had 2 dreams that I wanted. I wanted to become a traffic officer or a lawyer. So that was the 2 dreams that this young man has, and I began to study towards it. But one morning was about 4 o'clock, and we were busy making fire and getting ready to walk to school again, when the white farmer where my grandfather lived on came and he stopped at our house without asking any permission. He took me out of school, and I became a slave worker, began to work in the farm for R1 a month. And I have seen on the injustice on the farm. I had to go and get the cows and milk the cows. I saw the beatings that happened on the farm. And I will never forget it. After about 2 years, 3 years working on the farm, one evening, it was a Sunday evening, I asked myself, is this all that life can give me? Is this all? Is this how I will have to die? Like many of the people on the farm who died. And that evening was just about 12 o'clock in the morning, Monday morning. I jumped up out of the bed and I ran away. I wanted to run away so far from the farm and my family that no one will find me. But I had to pay a big price of running away. I began to live on the street and making friends with people that was involved in drugs and drinking. And very soon, I started to drink and using drugs on the street. And I will never forget the third thing that shaped me was at the age of 18 years old, living and doing the most horrific things, robbing people, seeing blood and violence on the street. I got very sick, and the doctors told me that I will have to die using drugs. On a Sunday morning, when my family would go to church, they would look to the other side and not wanting to be recognized that I'm part of their family. I was living on the streets, stinking, smelling. I was living with no hope. Until one day, my aunt stopped by and she looked at me and she says, Wilson, I'm going to give you 3 weeks to come and stay at my place. But in this 3 weeks, you need to change your life. You need to go and get a job and just get your life in order. Of course, I couldn't help myself, but I was so happy that my aunt would give me a place to stay and that I can have a roof over my head. And so I stayed with my aunt, and I was addicted to drugs, and so I was continuing using drugs. And it was the last Sunday, and I heard my aunt coming from church. And I said to myself, she will walk into my room and she's going to come and preach to me. And lo and behold, she walks into my room and she looked at me while I was lying on the bed under the influence of drugs. And she said, Wilson, look at you. You don't belong to a church. If you die today, you don't belong to a church. Who's going to bury you? And God uses that. She wasn't concerned about my soul. She was concerned if I belongs to a church. And I asked my aunt, I said, what must I do to belong to a church? And she said, why don't you come with me to church next Sunday? Of course, I was happy to stay another week with her. And then the next Sunday, she took me to church. I remember she gave me a blazer and I went and sat right in front of the pastor. She believed as I sit in front that the Spirit of God will be able to reach me. And it was my first time that I was in the church. And I remember as the pastor was preaching, I remember the prayer I prayed that day. Oh God, please let the pastor finish preaching, because I wanted just to go out and use drugs. And then he stopped when he was finished with his sermon. And he says, if there's any of the young people that wants to be part of the church, they need to come and go into that corner. Auntie Sheila will take and explain to them and take their names. And so we were 15 of us, and I was running to the corner and pushing everybody away, because I thought I just give my name and then of course I will belong to a church. And when I saw Auntie Sheila stood there, I said, Auntie Sheila, my name is Wilson. I'm just here. And she said, Wilson, not so in a hurry. The next 2 years, we're going to study the life of Jesus. And I remember I heard myself cursing her. I wasn't going to study for 2 years the life of Jesus, but I was very polite. I stood there and she explained that next Sunday we come together after church every Sunday, and for 1 hour we will have what we call in the Dutch Reformed Church confirmation classes. And I knew if I walk out of this church, I will not come back. And so she gave us a Bible and the book, and I walk out. And I knew that day I will not return except until Wednesday, when I heard all these voices in my head calling Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And I have been staying now with my aunt for a month, and she has never talked about Jesus. And I remember Auntie Sheila talked about how we would study the life of Jesus. So I went to my aunt and I said, can I come with you to church next Sunday again? And of course, she was very excited. She told all the neighbors that, hey, Wilson, he will come to church now. But I had a question. And I remember I went with her the second Sunday to church. I had my Bible and my little book, the study book that we were going to study the life of Jesus. And I remember after church, we sat in the corner, and I was just there because I had a question. I can't even remember our first lesson. When everybody stood up after an hour, I called Auntie Sheila one side, and we stood in the middle of the church. And I remember this Dutch Reformed church with a big ceiling and building. I stood there and I looked at her and I said, Auntie Sheila, can I ask you a question? And she said, yes, Wilson. I said, Auntie Sheila, where can I meet Jesus? And she looked at me without saying a word, and she turned around and she walked out of the church. I was very serious. I wanted to meet Jesus. And I remember as Auntie Sheila walked out of the church, I stood there and I still remember this prayer I prayed that day. I said, Lord, if you really say who you are, if you don't come and reveal yourself to me right now, at least I can say I've given you a chance. I think if you remember in my previous testimony, as I shared, when my mother died and they lowered the coffin in there, I wanted to jump into that coffin. And I remember when I walked away, I said, God, I hate you, I hate you. And now I'm standing here in the church. And I said, God, if you don't come and reveal yourself, at least I can say I've given you a chance. I was not even finished saying this when it appears that the roof of the church splits in two and lightning struck me down. And for 2 hours I was lying on the floor. And I remember as I woke up from the floor and I walked outside of the church, it was like I was walking on the cloud, and I heard all these voices, beautiful voices calling my name. Saw all these images. And normally it would take 10 minutes from church to where my aunt's house is. That day it took me an hour. As I just walking and looking around me in the beauty. And that morning I left my aunt's house under the influence of drugs. Of course I couldn't help myself. But as I walk into the door, my aunt looked at me and she says, Wilson, what happened with you? You have changed. You have changed. And I knew something happened in the church. I couldn't explain it. And I remember I said to her, just give me black coffee. And all of a sudden, as I was sitting there in the corner, I had this intense desire to begin to read the Bible. And Auntie Sheila has given me a Bible, and I started to read Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and by Friday, I came to the portion in Acts chapter 9, the story of Saul that became Paul on the road of Damascus. And as I read it, it was like God lifting this veil, and I realized I had the same encounter with Jesus that Paul had. That lightning struck him down, and the same lightning struck me down. And all of a sudden I realized that I had an incredible encounter in that church that day. And then I realized I've never touched drugs up to this day. God has set me free. And that is the power that whom the Son set free will be free indeed. So then I met this wonderful group, mixed young people, different background, races, coming to our church. This was in the late 80s. This was unheard of. And I remember I was the youth leader, and I looked at them, and they were from Youth with a Mission. And their lives looks like giants. They love God, and they were doing dramas, and I was inspired, and I was inspired by them. And I remember I started off wanting to also join Youth with a Mission. And I remember when I joined YWAM, God has used me incredibly before I joined YWAM. I've prayed for people in a wheelchair and they got healed. I have preached on the street, they called me evangelist. And so when I joined Youth with a Mission, I didn't thought that I need YWAM. I thought Youth with a Mission needs me. Remember, soon in our discipleship training school, every evening at 10, I would preach in the dorms with the students, and I was, the evangelist on the DTS until one morning. I had my Bible and my notebook, and I was on my way to class when I heard this voice. She says three times to me, Wilson, you are the most racist person you are the most racist person. And I said, Satan, I bind you in Jesus' name. And I heard the voice says, no, my son, this is not Satan. This is me speaking. And I decided not to go to class. I just wanted to make sure that this is really God, because I was convinced this is Satan that wanted to bring condemnation and guilt on me. And where the Youth with a Mission base was, it was surrounded by beautiful vineyards. And I remember this morning, instead of going to class, I went for a walk and I said, God, if it's really you, I want you to give me a sign. And I was not even finished saying that when it appears this huge screen in the air. And then as I look in the corner, I could see the movie begins to play. And it was me. I could see myself in this movie. And I saw the day when I stood there at the road and I wanted to have a lift. And that white man slammed the door. And all the events just played through. And all of a sudden I realized this was God speaking to me. But like all of us, we carry this invisible list with us. That's what I call it, the invisible list. And I pull it out. List of justification. And I said, God, I might be racist. I might have unforgiveness still in my life. I said, but where were you when my mother wanted to kill me? Where were you when my father ran away? I said, you telling me that I am a racist and I have unforgiveness. Where were you when that white man slammed the door in my face that morning and drove away? See, we all carry this invisible list of justification. I said, God, where were you when my father left me alone with my mother and I had to grow up with my grandfather and mother? So where were you when my dreams was taken away from me? I wanted to be a traffic officer and a lawyer, and I was taken out of school and I had to go and work as a slave labor for a white person. And as I was sharing my heart, I could feel the anger and the emotion coming up. And then I heard God saying, my son, can I ask you something? And I said to God, no, I am not finished. And God said, when you finish, I want to ask you a question. And eventually, I said, God, you can ask the question. What is the question? And then God asked me this question. And I believe, as you listen to this story, today God want to ask you as well this question. And then God says, Wilson, I can hear all the things that has happened in your life. That your mother wanted to kill you. You've never grown up without a father. The rejection, I can see that in your life, my son. That how you were taken out of school by white people and you had to go and work on the farm. But I want to ask you a question. Out of 1 or to 100, how much percentage responsibility will you take on? And it made me think. And I said, God, I would take only 5%. 95%, I would blame them. I would blame my mother. I would blame those white people. I would blame my father. And then God said to me, I will never ask more from you. I want you only to take the 5% responsibility for your life. And as I took that responsibility, that 5%, I fell on my knees and I began to cry out to God. And I began to confess. I began to ask my mother for forgiveness of wanting to kill me. Begin to ask my father for forgiveness. Begin to speak freedom over those white people. And I had an incredible, intense time of God dealing in my life. And I remember I went back that day, and the next day I went to my school leader and I shared with him what happened that day and why I was not in class. And I asked him if I could share, because God challenged me to ask white people on forgiveness on behalf of blacks. And that day in the classroom, the next morning, I stood in front of all those students, 49 of them, and I asked for forgiveness for the hatred and the unforgiveness in my heart towards white people. And then God led me to also ask for forgiveness to all the white people. And we had an incredible time. The Holy Spirit came and we began to wash one another's feet and we began to ask for forgiveness. And I remember this white lady, she was from Pretoria with long blonde hair. I was washing her feet, and when she was finished, she washed my feet. And as she was washing my feet, It was like I could hear God speaking to me, that heaven opened up, and God reminded me of the story of the prostitute in the Bible that came to him. And he says, go, your sins are forgiven. And as she was washing my feet, I heard God was saying, as you wash your feet, I am washing away the pain and the anger and the unforgiveness in your life. And that's where my story started and my journey. I have gone to over 70 different countries telling the story that when we forgive, God will forgive us. But when we do not forgive, we will never experience the forgiveness of God. I am so grateful what God has done in my life. And as you listen today, I believe if you take responsibility for your life, if you say today to Jesus, forgive me, that God is able to set us free from the rejection, even if it happened in the womb. Because sometimes that's the things that drives us to other things. He did it for me, and I believe that He can do it for you. May God bless you.